Rishi Sunak has sacked Nadhim Zahawi for breaching the ministerial code. Kate McCann joins us this morning to offer some analysis. Kate, what has Rishi Sunak said in his letter to the now former Conservative Party chairman?
So it's actually a very strong letter from the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. It's also quite long. It's been published alongside the full details of the investigation, or at least a 4-page letter from the independent advisor explaining and setting out exactly what has been found. I mean, a key paragraph in the Prime Minister's letter is where he says, following the completion of the independent advisor's investigation, it's clear that there's been a serious breach of the ministerial code. As a result, I've informed you of my decision to remove you from your position. I mean, he goes on to say that, of course, Mr Zahawi has done good work in government, and I'm sure that I can count on your support from the backbenchers, etc. But the really fascinating bit of Sir Laurie Magnus's investigation, I suppose, is where he talks about the reasons that he feels that Mr Zahawi has fallen short. And it's in the middle of the document. He basically is saying that after Mr Zahawi was appointed as the Chancellor in July 2022, he completed a declaration of interest form which contained no reference to the HMRC investigation. He goes on to say that a later form did acknowledge, by way of an attachment, that Mr Zahawi was in discussion with HMRC. But the report goes on to say that realistically, in that position, in that particular job, there should have been more clarity and more declaration of what was actually happening at the time. And because of that, ultimately, that's why the Prime Minister has decided he has to go. I mean, it's a very strongly worded conclusion, too, from Sir Laurie Magnus, saying, in holding the high privilege of being a Minister of the Crown, Mr Zahawi has shown insufficient regard for the general principles of the ministerial code and the requirements in particular under the 7 principles of public life to be honest, open and an exemplary leader through his own behaviour. There's no getting around that, really.
I realise we're just reading the letter now. Do you think it absolves some of the other key characters who have been at the heart of this in terms of responsibility? So by that I mean Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary. These are names that have been swirling around by way of what action could they have taken, should they have taken, was the right information passed to the right people at the right time, was the Prime Minister well informed enough to make the decision to appoint Nadhim Zahawi, for example? Do you think they are absolved of responsibility by Sir Laurie's report?
Well, as you say, we're still reading the full. I mean, there's only 4 pages here. It's not a full report in the sense that we're not getting sort of 20, 30 pages. But I think from first reading, it does seem to be suggesting that this is firmly at Mr Zahawi's door. I mean, what the report is saying here is, I would expect, well, I'll quote, I would expect a minister to inform their permanent secretary and to seek advice on the implications of a dispute with HMRC, and then goes on to lay out, as I did just there, that it wasn't laid out initially in a declaration of interest. It was added at a later date as an additional document. But still, I mean, I think what Sir Laurie Magnus is saying here is that given the nature of the investigation by HMRC, which started prior to his appointment as Secretary of State for Education in September 2021, so that's important. We were wondering when this all had started. He says, I consider that by failing to declare the ongoing investigation before July 2022, despite the ministerial declaration of interest form, that Mr Zahawi failed to meet the requirements. So what he seems to be saying is that there was enough time to go on and inform everybody in the way that he would be expected to, and that Nadhim Zahawi just didn't do that. For one reason or another, he just chose not to.
Kate, thank you very much. Kate will be back with Adam Bolton at 10 o'clock this morning. Michael Gove will join them live. This may have, I don't know, I don't want to speak out of turn, but he is doing the round this morning on behalf of the government, and he may have just been caught by surprise by the sacking of Nadhim Zahawi. Who knows? But so you will ask him, absolutely. Michael Gove will be asked that, among many other things, with Kate and Adam after 10 o'clock.
Well, he shouldn't have been caught by surprise. He should have read Tim Shipman's piece in the Sunday Times, the Sunday Times chief political commentator, because he called it just right. I mean, we've been leading it all morning, and Tim's with us now. Morning, Tim. I mean, you called
Good
this.
Morning.
You called this. You said that this was going to happen imminently, and it has.
Yeah, I mean, if Michael Gove's been caught by surprise, then someone's not been doing their job properly, because it was pretty clear to me all of yesterday that this was on its way. People in number 10 were sort of clearly on standby. And my understanding is that since Friday evening, there's been a sort of movable slot in Rishi Sunak's diary to have a conversation with Nadhim Zahawi. And it was fairly clear that they expected this to be the outcome of it, even before they received Sir Laurie Magnus's report. And there was enough information out there to know that Zahawi had not declared in the way that he ought to have done the fact of this investigation and the details that pertain to it after the event, when he had, paid a large sum of money to the revenue, a decent sum of which, over £1 million, was a penalty for failing to declare his taxes. So not only did he fail to declare his taxes, he failed to declare that he'd failed to declare his taxes. And I think there are questions here. Listening to your question, Callum, about does this absolve other people? I think it does partially, because Zahawi had a duty to be straight and wasn't. And there's only so much information that the people who do the investigating into, is this a suitable person to become a cabinet minister, are able to obtain. My understanding is that the proprietary and ethics team, PET as they call it in Whitehall, they were in contact with HMRC. They were aware back in July, when he became Chancellor, that there had been some to and fro between HMRC and Zahawi. But at that point, Zahawi appears not to have been sort of declaring the fact of these inquiries in any kind of meaningful, extensive fashion. And HMRC are under no duty to tell PET anything other than that there's an investigation. And by the time Rishi Sunak came to appoint Zahawi, that investigation by HMRC was at an end. He'd already paid the penalty. So all that PET were told, as I understand it, was that, there were no outstanding problems. And now something needs to change there going forwards, because, fine, Zahawi had a duty to declare things. He's been caught out and he's been sacked. But why was this ever allowed to happen in the first place? It should be possible for the proprietary and ethics team, when they're appointing ministers of the Crown, to find out more information from HMRC. The other guy, who got a lot of grief in the week was Simon Case, the cabinet secretary. People around at the top of the civil service sort of launched a bit of a protect case operation on Friday, because they thought it was unfair that he was being criticised, because he didn't have the information he needed. And really, it's quite straightforward. Nadhim Zahawi should have declared it, but it ought not to have taken this long for somebody at the top of government to got to grips with this. And frankly, if there hadn't been a leak to the newspapers, he'd still be in post.
Tim, do you think this is going as far as to say that Nadhim Zahawi was trying to hide this information, or he forgot to submit it? Are we clear?
Well, I mean, it's impossible to get inside somebody else's head, but it's possible to conclude, I would have thought, that if you're being offered the chance of a lifetime to become Chancellor of the Exchequer, and you are in some form of dispute with the revenue, which is one of the agencies, under the purview of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, it may be that you think, if this is about to be sorted out, that you might keep that to yourself for the time being. I think that would be, a logical human conclusion to draw about what his motivation might have been. But until he tells us, it's impossible to know. The significant thing here, of course, is that he hasn't been offered the chance to resign, that the breaches were sufficiently serious that Sunak has just summarily dismissed him. I think there's a lot of Tory MPs who would have been quite glad if that had happened a week ago, and that they hadn't, my WhatsApp is already full of people going, why did we have a week of pointless bleeding out on a subject where it was perfectly evident a week ago that there were serious questions to answer, and it really ought not to have taken another week to get to the bottom of things. It should have been evident from his declarations. I can't imagine that Sir Laurie Magnus would have spent more than a day trying to get hold of the key people here. It seems odd that it's taken quite this long to sort out. And I was out and about with people from Westminster last night, including senior people in the Labour Party, and they were completely incredulous that Sunak had taken this long, and cock a hoop as a consequence. So, while he has decided to look strong now, there'll be people wondering, is this really the best way of going about things in the future?
I wanted to ask you that about, because there was some concern when we were discussing, we've been leading with your piece all morning on the paper till it broke sort of 15 minutes ago, that Nadhim Zahawi had been sacked by Rishi Sunak. But we were talking about whether Rishi Sunak would look weak if he gave him the opportunity to step back himself. There's been a lot of criticism, as you say, that Rishi Sunak didn't act sooner. Does this help him that he has been assertive and strong and done this now, albeit some people may see it's a bit late?
Well, I think it certainly doesn't hurt. I think if he'd been allowed to walk when Magnus's report is quite as strong as it is, I think again that would have been questionable. Better late than never, as some people will say. Sunak is a great believer in press and in making sure that the facts are known, and rather than just doing things on impulse. And sometimes in politics, having good method and process is very important. And in running a lot of the aspects of government, being a good administrator, I think a lot of people would acknowledge that Sunak's reasonably good at that and goes about things in the right way. But of course, the job of Prime Minister is not just about running the country, it's about winning elections and about convincing your side that you're moving in the right direction, that you look like a leader. It's about politics. And I think frankly, there are people in senior roles on both front benches who think that the two leaders we've got now are, good technocrats, good administrators potentially, but neither of them really, either Sunak or Starmer, has a particularly deft fingertip touch for the sort of, the feral art of politics. And that's why the next election, is going to be an interesting one, because last time round we had two characters in Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn who inspired huge passions, positive and negative, and had an ability to sort of cut through with people who don't necessarily pay a great deal of attention to politics. And now we've got two people who are, very sort of conventional political technocratic figures, neither of whom is particularly inspiring or someone who gets on and leads. And it's it's going to be an interesting exercise over the next year to see whether Rishi Sunak can turn sort of competent governance into a shift in the polls and convincing some members of the public that he's worth a second look. But there's certainly people in both parties who don't think that people are going to be rushing out at the next election with a song in their hearts, deeply inspired and passionate to vote for their side. And having gone from two people like that to two people not like that, British politics has changed its dimensions a little bit.
Do you think Nadhim Zahawi is going to disappear now? Is he going to go away quietly?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, he was clearly putting around that he hadn't done anything wrong. That's a pretty impossible position to sustain now. I think the sensible thing that Sunak has done is, this investigation is so strong in its conclusions that there ought not to be on the Conservative benches too much sympathy for Zahawi in the way that there was, a year or so ago for Owen Paterson, who'd been told that he'd behaved badly. There are lots of Tory MPs thought he'd been terribly badly treated and the process hadn't been right, and they got Boris Johnson to try and sort of bail him out, which was disastrous for Boris Johnson. I don't think there'll be a repeat of that. Zahawi is not an unpopular character. His links with the YouGov polling firm mean that most MPs have had contact with him, in one way or another for 20 years. A lot of them like him. He's a sort of Ebullient character, and inspires quite a lot of deep friendships, as far as I can see, around SW1. But the guy doesn't have a leg to stand on in terms of how he's behaved here. And this report is so strong that it's quite hard to see him returning to the cabinet before the general election. I think there are some people think if he'd walked a week ago and said, I'm becoming a distraction, this is a great pity, I don't want to get in the way of my party, it's entirely possible to see that that would have been regarded as rather noble, and he might even have been back in the cabinet, within, sort of sometime next year, when Sunak does a sort of expected reshuffle in the run-up to the election. That looks pretty impossible now, and I think we have to sort of put this down as another of those careers which has crashed and burned.
Rishi Sunak, known to love due process, Tim, and we can look sort of ahead to when the report on Dominic Raab's behaviour will come back. But how about looking back to his decision to reinstate Suella Braverman just days after she was found to have broken the ministerial code, which he is now citing as the reason for sacking Zahawi? Do those two things match up?
Well, clearly they don't, but the answer to that question is to say that Rishi Sunak does have some feral politics. Suella Braverman emerged as a key figure on the Tory right, and both of the last two prime ministers felt the need to offer her the Home Office in order to ensure that they became leader of the Conservative Party. That is the one standout, cynical, classic political manoeuvre that Sunak has done. And while it looks unedifying to the world outside, there are some MPs who think, well, at least that means he knows how the world works. And I think, a lot of people are pretty convinced that there's no way Rishi Sunak would be Prime Minister now if he hadn't attracted Suella Braverman's support. That's the sort of simple, cynical answer, and I think it's the correct one. But I do think there's a little bit of another aspect here, which is that Suella Braverman, in a sense, had not wronged Rishi Sunak.
Sure.
Her behaviour happened under Liz Truss. Sunak, in terms of Zahawi, has been going around saying, look, these breaches of, the penalty he paid, the tax investigation, all happened before I was Prime Minister. And on that basis, if Magnus had cleared him, I think Sunak would have found a way of saying, he didn't do this to me. But of course, the misleading, do we call it something as strong as lying? It's certainly economic with the actuality. It's not providing the full information. That has happened to Rishi Sunak. He's clearly absolutely livid about it. And that is why he's taken the politically sensible, but also, I think, the humanly cathartic decision to fire him.
Well, you've filled me in a lot with that introduction. So obviously this is breaking news, and I haven't read Rishi Sunak's letter, but it does sound like Laurie Magnus did do his report. That's one thing I was thinking, that would Rishi Sunak fire Nadhim Zahawi without having had Laurie Magnus's report, having obviously said due process must take place. And it seems logical that he would have received Laurie Magnus's report. So that is Rishi Sunak's cover in order to fire Nadhim Zahawi. As I said on my Times Radio show on Friday, I do know Laurie Magnus because amazingly he was chairman of English Heritage when I was the Heritage Minister, and he is a very good bloke, if I can put it that way. He's a decent man, a hard-working guy who's put a lot into public service, but he's also a banker and he knows his way around money. So I can imagine that his report is very thorough, and it seems like it was pretty unambiguous. It's given Rishi Sunak the chance to sack Nadhim Zahawi, and then to talk about the politics of this. Of course, we've all been saying really for days now that Nadhim Zahawi should have seen the writing on the wall and got out of the way, because he's become a major distraction for the government, which has more than enough problems to deal with already.
Well, let's go through the details. Nadhim Zahawi failed to declare to the HMRC investigation after he was appointed as Chancellor on the 5th of July 2022, of course, by Boris Johnson. We understand that by that stage, the investigation had been ongoing for more than a year, and it was only on the 15th of July that Zahawi updated his declaration. And then the second breach of the ministerial code was by failing to disclose the fact he'd paid a penalty for tax avoidance. He reached that settlement in August of last year, but it wasn't till the middle of January 2023 that details emerged of that. So those were the problems. What I think is quite interesting, and Callum was raising this earlier on, the timing of it. I mean, Tim Shipman, we've been leading the programme throughout the course of the morning. Tim Shipman, Sunday Times chief political commentator, writing in the paper today that the writing was on the wall for Nadhim Zahawi. It was imminent, this sacking. And we all came in this morning going, well, it's not going to happen on a Sunday morning, is it? That would be curious timing. I mean, Michael Gove is in the middle of a media round at the moment.
Yes.
And he's about to come on to Times Radio from 10 o'clock with Kate McCann and Adam Bolton. So we'll get some answers from him. But does it seem bizarre timing to you?
No, it doesn't in some ways, because if you think about the alternatives, what would the alternatives be? I mean, maybe he could have, Rishi Sunak could have choreographed when Laurie Magnus was going to receive his report. But I think Rishi Sunak can say, and he can probably say it with a straight face, look, I asked Laurie Magnus to do the report. Laurie Magnus worked at pace and produced it. And the minute he had completed it, he gave it to me. And the minute I read the contents, I knew I had to fire Nadhim Zahawi, and you would have killed me if I'd waited 24 hours, because I wanted to manage the news cycle. I acted immediately and I acted decisively. That's what he'll be saying. And the interesting thing about what Laurie Magnus has apparently said in this thing is, of course, it doesn't actually address the issue of what Nadhim Zahawi may or may not have done in terms of his tax arrangements. It's a pretty clinical and contained report that focuses solely on his failure to declare the fact that these investigations were going on. So he hasn't got into any of the detail, as far as I understand it, of actually what Nadhim Zahawi's tax arrangements were and why they may have been wrong.
I mean, people will ask the question, why is it up to MPs to declare it? Why is it that the civil service isn't looking into this and saying, right, I want access to all of the information on this person who is potentially going to be Chancellor or Culture Secretary or whatever? Why is it reliant on the MP? It just seems the wrong way round.
It's a really good question. And, when you get a point, first of all, you are elected as an MP. So, pretty much, there are certain rules which prevent you staying as an MP, for example, if you become bankrupt. But in theory, you're elected and then you're chosen by the Prime Minister. Whereas I was always curious, the fact that I could swan in and become a minister, but anyone who was going to be a kind of senior civil servant would be subject to quite intense vetting, particularly if they're in a sort of prominent department like the Home Office or Defence, where actually their affairs would be looked into. But no one is able to do that with ministers. It's an interesting question. But at the same time, you expect, famous last words from me, you expect ministers and MPs to be completely transparent in what they've got. And I think the mood has certainly changed in the sense I think people genuinely now almost over-declare things in order not to be caught out rather than under-declare. But it is an interesting point that ministers genuinely, as far as I can remember, apart from signing the Official Secrets Act, don't receive any kind of positive vetting.
I mean, there has been criticism, hasn't there, of civil servants that they didn't work this out and they didn't find this out. So I guess by the fact that what has come out today in some ways does get them off the hook, that they're not going to be criticised now because actually it wasn't declared and in some ways was almost hidden by Nadhim Zahawi.
Well, your tax affairs are private. I mean, in theory, it is between you and the taxman. And a civil servant couldn't just ring up the HMRC and say, by the way, I'm investigating Nadhim Zahawi. Although I gather that in the Financial Times yesterday, HMRC apologised for not responding to an FOI request to say when they denied that any minister was under investigation. And they got that wrong, and they admit that they should have at least said a minister is under investigation. But, our tax affairs are private, and we don't want anyone just being able to ring up and say, can you please tell me all about Ed Vaizey's tax? Because that would be wholly wrong.
Do you think this is benefiting Rishi Sunak? Do you think he does look strong? I mean, we've had this text which has come in from Simon saying he can't win Riza Zahawi. Wait for the inquiry, it's too slow. Don't wait for the inquiry, it's too hasty.
Yeah, exactly. It is very difficult. I mean, with hindsight or not, as the case may be, I think people have been saying this for several days now, and it's certainly my view. I think Nadhim Zahawi should have stood down of his own volition and said, I'm a distraction, I'm innocent, but I'm going to clear my name away from government. He didn't give the Prime Minister that option, so he's lost any kind of, I know it sounds a bit weird to say, any kind of brownie points that he could have gained with the Prime Minister on that. So he's lost that. But at the same time, I think Rishi Sunak was right. I mean, he couldn't win, but he was probably right to say, let's do due process. I want it to be absolutely clear that I'm sacking Nadhim Zahawi for the right reasons, if you like, rather than political expediency. And I also want to say that I will, stand by ministers who are capable of having their names cleared. And luckily for him, Laurie Magnus, who is very good, acted quickly and has given him the excuse he needed to kind of clear this out.
Ed,
it's obviously not over because it's obviously a gift for Keir Starmer next week, but
of course,
it has at least lanced the bill boil a bit.
In the letter, Ed, from to Nadhim Zahawi from the Prime Minister, it says, and I quote, "It is clear there has been a serious breach of the ministerial code. As a result, I've informed you of my decision to remove you from your position in His Majesty's government. Should Nadhim Zahawi also have the Conservative whip removed?"
When I said earlier it's not over, this is kind of what I mean as well. I don't see a case for removing the Conservative whip at the moment, and it sort of goes back to what Chloe was saying about this odd position that MPs have. I mean, they are elected, and in a sense, they serve as MPs at the pleasure of their constituents, and they serve in government at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's removed him from government for breaching the ministerial code. But arguably,
has he fallen below the standards that the electorate expect, though? But almost by definition of breaching the ministerial code.
Well, I don't see a case for removing the Conservative whip. I think that can take things too far. But at the end of the day, it will be down to his constituents and indeed his local Conservative association if they think that Nadhim Zahawi has gone too far. There are plenty of MPs who have had various scandals who've gone on to be re-elected by their constituents, and the constituents have in effect given their verdict. It didn't occur to me when I heard about Nadhim Zahawi losing his job in government that the next stage should be considering whether he should keep the whip. I don't see that as appropriate.
Ed, good to speak to you. Thank you so